Um, let's consider some other aspects since we were talking about Heidegger last time, but I only mentioned Heidegger right at the end, but the whole presentation nonetheless was touching on the type of knowledge Heidegger had. We summed up by saying in his criticism of Judaism or of Jewish thought, on analogy to criticizing the thought of Werner Jaeger or the thought of um, I'm going to say a nationality of some kind. Somebody criticizes the thought of the Chinese, for instance. That happens all the time. And how that we shouldn't judge this to say merely because somebody criticizes the thought of the Chinese, that means necessarily that they want to exterminate the Chinese, for instance. So it's perfectly legitimate for Heidegger, however many times it was, 16 times or whatever, to criticize the thought that he characterizes as Jewish. But now let's see the positive side of Heidegger's vision. So rather than the criticism of the Jewish thought, which includes basically Spinoza I think Heidegger can't really talk a lot about Spinoza, maybe because he's not a Spinoza scholar properly. I don't know how much he actually says about Spinoza directly, but I think the pantheismus strike, which is also known as the Spinoza strike or the Spinoza controversy, is at the core of showing what Heidegger doesn't like about this direction that then eventually reaches Marx, and then we do have a lot of criticism from Heidegger of Marx, from the metaphysics of Marx. And then I guess supposing putting it that way, of course it would have to be shown why there's this Jewish thought, but I think it's because the Jews have produced a thinker. Marx is preeminent, is even called a prophet, and this is what he's given expression to, and therefore it's a statement of the Jews in this sense. That's I think that's one sense in which we can understand Heidegger speaking of Jewish thought and the criticism of Jewish thought. In the same way, he calls himself sort of the one who's making the expression of the Western tradition as a whole. And therefore, you criticize Heidegger the way he thinks about it, that's the same as criticizing Western thought. The same way as the most exemplary figures amongst the Western thinkers, the most exemplary figures amongst the Jewish thinkers. And then one can ask about what the borderlines are. So whether this had to be nationalistic. Probably Heidegger, because of the emphasis on language. We could see did, but we should remember this emphasis on language too is not the same thing as as anything like a Darwinianism, which of course was already going on in America, in which probably the Nazis deliberately duplicated to some extent, or copied the programs of racial hygiene of the Americans. So what is the positive vision, though, that Heidegger's offering? So we could look at this in terms of this idea, the dritte Humanismus of Jaeger, which is a name that somebody else put on his work around 1920, which he, I think he accepted it with pleasure. And the idea is the first humanism was the Italian humanism, aka the Renaissance. And then the second one is about Goethe, and to some extent it's still alive in Gambin's readings of Kafka. One could say it's both a superficial statement, but also, when interpreted in the way I interpreted it, also a substantive statement. Is that Kafka has, it's objective. It clearly known that Kafka has duplicated the style of Goethe in many respects, and also von Kleist had used that strategy prior to Kafka. So that we have this Goethean humanism, beside from the polymath elements, that besides from his economics and his it's like a called Binswanger that wrote about Goethe, magic and economics. I think so. But aside from everything else Goethe did, theory of colors and etc., his hallucinations of the growth of flora, or I guess about the animals and vegetables and growth. But in any case, aside from all that, there's this pattern that's sort of susceptible of understanding in terms of ethopoiesis. And then one can ask the characters of Goethe, when taken really seriously and inhabited as models, how much is the education of our character possible through presenting these models as though we're as persons, were the persona or the actors that are acting out this Goethean play, and then in our version of the Kafkaean bureaucratic nightmare, so-called. But always in this sense that in talking of the bureaucratic nightmare, we're talking somehow in the within hailing distance of eternity somehow. That seems to be the charm of this conviction of Goethe's. This is so-called Olympian quality that carries over into these other writers, but then it gets interpreted by Agamben. So I say it's still alive. Agamben's very old, but it's still alive in that people are still listening to Agamben, still hear Agamben. When Agamben dies, they'll still be listening to it, I think, at least for a while longer. So the second humanism then is still alive, and it's sort of the humanism that says the law isn't really the law, it's something else. It was never the law. And so that's a very interesting way to try to look at things. And then this third humanism, this one that Strauss points to Heidegger's reading, the Sophist book, it has to do with this unleashing of the so-called hidden Germany, or this Holderleinian Germany, which then is presented as the antithesis of democracy, of bourgeois life for money, and all the trappings of repulsive, unhuman life. Like, I mean, if you picture kind of, it's already probably very westernized, but if you think of the Kurosawa movies, I mean, isn't it to some extent when Heidegger says, I thought I was seeing another world when I saw Rashomon, but actually this is part of the technological essence, since it was filmed and the cameras and so on are part of the Western technological essence, and therefore Japan isn't really showing itself as Japan, to the extent that there's still this idea that one can as far as possible, avoid this fate of the liberal democratic society. And this view is populated partially by Heidegger with um, it said Hellenistic echoes, but maybe Greek, just classical Greek echoes more so. But uh, so there's a specific Stimmung, or sort of attunement, as is translated, to this whole der dritte Humanismus project, which I think, yeah, we can locate that in the dedication to Nator at the beginning of the Sophist book, when Heidegger is talking about the inner responsibility. This is what would the ethopoiesis would touch, the inner responsibility of the young Germans who then, the way he understands philosophy is basically there's an apprentice and a teacher, and the teacher is a master at his work, and he makes the young students into people like himself. It's an ethopoetic process. It makes the students. So in that sense, it's yeah, we do have to consider Heidegger's ethical tact quite a bit, I think.